Welcome to week 1 anatomy. This session will be talking about the brain. So, the brain can be divided into 4 main compartments. The first compartment is the cerebrum. The cerebrum is what makes the brain, the cerebral cortex, and many other stuff. Second, we have the diencephalon. Diencephalon in the meaning of the midbrain. Third, we have the brain stem, which plays an important role in linking the spinal cord and the brain. And finally, we have the cerebellum. So let's look further into what is the cerebrum. The cerebrum can be described as hemispheres, both the right and the left hemispheres. It can also be further divided into lobes. And finally, we can look at the cross-section of the cerebrum. But first, let's take a look about the hemispheres. The hemispheres can be divided into 2 different sections, the sulci and the gyri. The sulci are the major grooves in the brain, while the gyri are the convolutions that make up those grooves. So for the sulci, we have 3 major types. We have the central sulcus, we have the calcarine sulcus, and we have the parieto-occipital sulcus. While for the gyri, we have also 3 different kinds. We have the precentral gyrus, we have the postcentral gyrus, and we have the transverse temporal gyri. Okay, that's for the sulci and gyri for the hemispheres. Now let's move on to the lobes of the cerebrum. So mainly the lobes, we have 4 different lobes. We have the frontal lobe, we have the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. These lobes are separated by the sulci and the gyri that we have stated earlier. So, for example, we have the central sulcus that divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Also, the parieto-occipital sulcus divides the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. There is also a Sylvian fissure, which is the largest fissure in the brain, that separates the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe. So that's for the lobes of the cerebrum. Now let's move on to the cross-section of the cerebrum. So for the cross-section of the cerebrum, we can observe 3 different sections: the gray matter, the white matter, and the ventricles. And there are also surrounded by the ventricles something called the deep gray matter. For the ventricles, we have 4 ventricles. We have the lateral ventricles up above, we have the 3rd ventricle in the middle, and the 4th ventricle in the end. And now that we have finished the cerebrum finally, let's move on to the diencephalon. So, as you can observe in this picture, the diencephalon represents the center of the brain and involves many things such as the limbic system that we will discuss later in the course. The diencephalon mainly consists of 3 things: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the pituitary. Maybe you are familiar with these terminology or these sections, as the hypothalamus is one of the glands that are responsible for releasing many hormones, and the pituitary master glands, for example, in sex hormones and stuff that we'll discuss later in the course. So that's for the diencephalon. Now let's move for the brain stem. So in order to talk about the brain stem, we need to subdivide it into 3 different sections. For the first section, we'll talk about the composition of the brain stem and what does it contains, what's the compartments of the brain stem. So for the composition of the brain stem, we have 3 different components. We have the midbrain, we have the pons, and we have the medulla oblongata. Now let's move on to the cross-section lamina of the brain stem. So if we take a cross-section lamina of the brain stem, what we will observe is that it will be composed of different sections. So here, as you can see, it's drawn a simple cross-section lamina of the brain stem that connects the spinal cord to the brain. It is divided by the dotted lines here into different sections that we will state. So until the drawing is complete, let's discuss what's the importance of this cross section. So mainly the brainstem is what separates the brain from the spinal cord, and what connects them is the brainstem, and that's why we are studying this cross section. So it's mainly composed of these three sections: the basis, the tegmentum, and the tectum. Finally, we'll talk about the cranial nerves. Okay, the cranial nerves are very important and are major in the brainstem, where they are the type of nerves that are colored here in the picture from green, blue, and yellow. There are 12 cranial nerves to be exact. So these cranial nerves is what controls to get the signal from the body to the central nervous system, and that's are mainly controlled by these nerves that are present in the brainstem. So now let's move on to the last and the final part of the brain, finally, the cerebellum. So the cerebellum can be decomposed into transverse subdivisions, where in these subdivisions it is furtherly subdivided into three different sections. We have the anterior, the posterior, and the flocculonodular lobes that are separated by something called the vermis. So that's for the transverse subdivisions. What else can we talk about for the cerebellum? Also, the cerebellum, we can talk about the composition. So, what is the cerebellum composed of? So mainly the cerebellum is composed of different layers such as the white matter and the gray matter that we've discussed earlier. So the cortex of the cerebellum is called folia. Here written with capital I. That was a technical mistake in the video. We have also the deep white matter in the composition of the cerebellum. We have paired deep nuclei, so these are nuclei that uncertain and paired together. And finally, we have the paired deep peduncles. And with that, we conclude the anatomy of the brain. I know it was a hard journey, but I think it's worth it. Thank you for attending week 1 anatomy.